Night descends over Frankfurt. The lamps flicker on wet cobblestones. A man walks slowly along the River Main, his coat drawn tight against the cold wind. He is old now, his white hair wild, his eyes half lost in the fog. But his mind remains sharp, restless, burning. This man, Arthur Schopenhauer, had spent a lifetime staring into the abyss of existence and trying to name what he saw there. Not God, not reason, not progress. He called it will, not will as in choice, but as in the blind, aimless force that drives everything to exist, to consume, to struggle, and to suffer. The same energy that pulls the roots of a tree toward water also pulls the human heart toward its own undoing. Life, he said, is not designed to make us happy. It is designed to make us want, endlessly. In the silence of his study, surrounded by his books and his poodle named Atman, Schopenhauer wrote as though he were carving words into eternity. He believed that behind the shimmering veil of the visible world, the colors, the forms, the people we love, there hides something darker and more primal. He called that veil representation, a mask, a performance, an illusion projected by the mind. Everything we see, every mountain, every human face, is not the thing itself, but a kind of dream the intellect paints so we can endure the truth that underneath it all lies will, the monstrous heartbeat of existence, pushing everything forward without meaning or mercy. To Schopenhauer, the universe was not the rational harmony that philosophers before him had imagined. It was a battlefield of desires, a vast cosmic hunger feeding on itself. He had grown up in an age intoxicated by optimism. The Enlightenment had promised reason, science, and progress. Kant had revealed a moral order behind the chaos. Hegel was declaring that history itself was marching toward freedom. But Schopenhauer sat apart from all of it, quietly shaking his head. He saw no rational destiny, no divine plan, only striving without purpose. Even when humanity built cities, wrote symphonies, or fell in love, it was, in his view, only the will disguising itself. A desperate energy searching for satisfaction and finding only more hunger. The world, he wrote, is my representation. But behind the representation, the world itself, is will. The will to live, to create, to suffer. It was a revelation as haunting as it was beautiful. For the first time in centuries, philosophy spoke not of perfection or salvation, but of the raw ache of being alive. Schopenhauer's life, like his philosophy, was shaped by solitude and resistance. He was born in Danzig in 1788 into a wealthy merchant family. His father, Heinrich, believed in commerce, travel, and Enlightenment ideals. His mother, Johanna, was a writer, proud, social, adored by the salons of Weimar. Arthur was their shadow. While she entertained poets and thinkers, he read ancient Sanskrit texts and the Upanishads, discovering in the East what the West had forgotten, that life was not progress, but cycle. Desire was not freedom, but bondage. And peace did not come from victory, but from renunciation. He once wrote, "Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom." That sentence became a prophecy, not just for his philosophy, but for his own existence. In his early years, he believed that knowledge could save the world. He studied under Goethe, admired Kant, and began to write with the confidence of a man certain that truth would win its way to daylight. But the world was not interested in what he saw. When he published The World as Will and Representation in 1818, it was met not with admiration, but silence. The German universities were in thrall to Hegel, whose philosophy promised light, progress, and reason. Schopenhauer offered the opposite: darkness, suffering, and the futility of desire. He was ignored, dismissed, and forgotten. In bitterness, he withdrew from academic life. He moved to Frankfurt, where he lived alone for 40 years, surrounded by his books, his dog, and his contempt for human illusion. Yet, even in his solitude, he felt the pulse of the will, that restless, unending drive that moves every creature, every lover, every empire. And he wrote to expose it, not with despair, but with a strange kind of honesty, as if truth, no matter how painful, were the only act of mercy left. When he looked out at the river from his window, he saw the same pattern everywhere. A hungry world devouring itself, repeating the same motions endlessly. He said that the will is like a wheel of fire, turning, consuming, burning through all forms, only to rise again. Every joy carries the seed of pain. Every success opens the door to new suffering. And even the happiest life, he believed, is only a brief reprieve from the inevitability of disappointment. To live, for Schopenhauer, is to fight a battle you cannot win. Not because you are weak, but because life itself is conflict. But perhaps the most striking thing about Schopenhauer was not his darkness, but his serenity. He did not preach despair for its own sake. He was not a cynic or a nihilist. He simply refused to look away. He believed that wisdom begins when illusion ends, when one finally sees that the pursuit of happiness is itself the source of suffering. That peace begins, paradoxically, in surrender. He called it denial of the will, a turning away from desire, from striving, from the noise of the world, to find, in art, in compassion, and in contemplation, a quiet form of salvation. And so, as he stood by the window, watching the river pass beneath the night sky, he did not smile, but he did not weep either. He simply saw. He saw the world for what it was, beautiful and cruel, radiant and tragic. A shadow cast by something deeper than reason. The will. The eternal hunger that creates and destroys. The force that makes us alive, and the truth that makes us human. In the early years of the 19th century, while most of Europe looked west toward progress, Arthur Schopenhauer looked east, toward silence, toward renunciation, toward the ancient wisdom of India. The philosophers around him were building monuments to reason. Hegel spoke of spirit unfolding through history. Fichte and Schelling celebrated the triumph of self-consciousness. But Schopenhauer saw in all of this a kind of arrogance, a blindness to the suffering that forms the bedrock of existence. He found no comfort in the promise of human advancement. So he turned to a different mirror, one that reflected not man's progress, but his impermanence. In his study, filled with German manuscripts and Sanskrit texts, Schopenhauer discovered voices that seemed to echo his own despair. The Upanishads, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, and above all, the teachings of Buddha. They spoke of a truth he already felt in his bones, that desire is the source of suffering, and that peace can only come when desire itself is stilled. He wrote, "In the whole world there is no study so beneficial and so elevating as that of the Upanishads." To him, these were not exotic curiosities. They were confirmations. Ancient wisdom rediscovered under European light. Where Christianity had offered salvation through faith, and modern philosophy through knowledge, the East offered liberation through understanding. In Hindu metaphysics, Schopenhauer found the concept of Maya, the illusion that hides reality behind appearances. He saw in it a twin to his own idea of representation. Both described a world projected by the mind, a veil of forms that deceives the senses into thinking it perceives truth. And behind that veil, whether one called it Brahman or will, lay the same force. A universal, restless energy, the thing in itself, that moves all existence. For Schopenhauer, this was not coincidence. It was convergence. He wrote as if the East had already dreamed what the West was only beginning to suspect. When he encountered Buddhism, he felt as though he had found a mirror polished to perfection. Here was a philosophy that began not with God or creation, but with suffering. And instead of denying suffering, it stared directly into it, the same way Schopenhauer had done. The Four Noble Truths struck him like revelations he had already written in another language. Life is suffering. Suffering arises from desire. The cessation of desire is the end of suffering. And the path to that cessation is wisdom and compassion. He recognized in this a kind of metaphysical minimalism, a system not built on faith, but an observation. And he admired that Buddhism, unlike Western religion, did not promise eternity. It promised release. In the image of the Bodhisattva, the enlightened being who renounces nirvana to help others awaken, Schopenhauer saw the highest expression of compassion. To him, compassion, Mitleid, was the only bridge between one suffering being and another. If the world was truly a battlefield of desire, then pity was not weakness. It was resistance. He wrote, "Compassion is the negation of the will to live. It is the beginning of wisdom." Through compassion, he believed, one could step outside the cycle of craving and pain. It was not salvation in the Christian sense, but liberation from the compulsion to be. To the Europe of his day, these ideas were almost incomprehensible. They sounded like resignation, like quiet madness. But to Schopenhauer, they were clarity itself. He understood that the modern West was drunk on optimism, while the East had long sobered up. The Enlightenment had told man that he could master nature. The East had whispered that he is nature, and that mastery is illusion. While Europe glorified the will to power, Schopenhauer glorified the will to peace. He began to describe art, music, and contemplation as moments when the will falls silent, brief windows through which one glimpses eternity without desire. When a person loses themselves in a symphony or a painting, he said, they momentarily become pure subject of knowledge, freed from the chains of wanting. It is, in a small way, enlightenment. Music, above all, he believed, was the direct expression of will itself, a mirror of the inner essence of the world, translated into sound. Through music, he wrote, we do not escape reality, we understand it, without words, without illusion. In Buddhism's path of detachment, he found not coldness, but compassion, not denial of life, but acceptance of its transience. He saw that pain, when understood, loses its sting. That suffering, when seen without resistance, reveals truth. This was not pessimism, it was a kind of lucid mercy. To look upon the world, to see its hunger, its endless desire, and still to feel love for it, that, for Schopenhauer, was the closest thing to salvation. When he read the line from the Dhammapada, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. He underlined it twice. He believed that Buddhism had accomplished what Western religion had only dreamed: to unite truth with compassion, and to free the soul without God. In his notebooks, he called the Buddha the greatest sage to have lived. And yet, he was careful to remain a philosopher, not a disciple. He never knelt. He only listened. To his readers, it seemed strange that a man so rooted in European thought could be so shaped by the East. But perhaps that was his genius, to build a bridge where others saw a void. Through Schopenhauer, the Western mind began to meet the Eastern soul. Nietzsche, Freud, Jung, and Wittgenstein would all cross that bridge after him. Zen would find its way into modern thought. Mindfulness would one day be taught in hospitals and schools. The world, without realizing it, would begin to speak his language. Late in life, Schopenhauer often said that his happiest hours were spent in silence. He would sit beside his dog, the firelight flickering across his books, and read the Upanishads aloud. When asked what they taught him, he answered softly, "They teach that the self is not the body, not the intellect, but the eternal witness of both." He found in that line the peace that had eluded him in philosophy, a peace not of victory, but of understanding. For Schopenhauer, the East was not a foreign world. It was the mirror in which he finally saw himself clearly. And when he gazed into it, he saw the same truth reflected back, that beneath the noise and striving of human life, there is only one movement, the will, blind, eternal, and endless. But also, perhaps, there is a way to step aside, to let the will pass through, and to stand still, awake and free. The lecture hall at the University of Berlin was full to bursting. Students crowded every bench, their eyes fixed on a tall man standing at the front. His name was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the philosopher of history, of spirit, of progress. He spoke like a prophet of reason. He told his students that reality itself was rational, that every contradiction was part of an evolving logic, that history was the unfolding of freedom through time. It was intoxicating. It was triumph. It was the sound of philosophy turning into religion. And in the back of that same city, in a small rented apartment, a very different man sat listening to the echo of that applause and seethed. Arthur Schopenhauer hated illusions. He hated them more than suffering itself. To him, illusion was the root of human tragedy. The belief that life could be perfected, that reason could tame chaos, that optimism was anything but self-deception. He once wrote, "Life is a business that does not cover its costs." Hegel called history a divine march toward liberty. Schopenhauer called it a perpetual comedy of errors, a machine that repeats the same follies, each generation believing it has invented meaning anew. Where Hegel saw progress, Schopenhauer saw pattern. Where others saw light, he saw shadow. He was not merely disagreeing, he was declaring war. When Schopenhauer published The World as Will and Representation in 1818, he was convinced that he had written something immortal, a philosophy that peeled away every illusion of metaphysics. He believed it would silence the old schools of thought. Instead, it was ignored. Hegel dominated every lecture hall in Germany. His followers filled universities, journals, newspapers. Schopenhauer's book, meanwhile, gathered dust. In a moment of defiant pride, he decided to give his lectures at the same hour as Hegel's, as if daring fate to choose between truth and popularity. Fate chose Hegel. Almost every student stayed in Hegel's class. Schopenhauer lectured to empty chairs. He would later say, "The audience I speak for has not yet been born." This failure wounded him deeply. He retreated from academia altogether, withdrawing into his solitude like a general who refuses to surrender, but no longer trusts his own army. He came to believe that the entire world of philosophy had become corrupt, a market of ideas built on vanity, on the craving for prestige rather than understanding. In his notebooks, he called the universities barracks of stupidity, and Hegel a charlatan who has replaced truth with dialectical fog. To him, Hegel's system, that vast, intricate pyramid of logic, was not enlightenment. It was theater. An elaborate mask meant to conceal the fact that no one truly knew why we suffer. Schopenhauer accused modern philosophy of betraying its ancient purpose. Philosophy, he said, was meant to tell the truth about the human condition, not to justify it. It should begin with pain, not perfection. The task, he wrote, is not to paint existence in rosy colors, but to see it as it is, a scene of constant struggle, where victory means nothing more than survival. For him, every optimistic philosophy, whether Christian theology, Enlightenment progress, or Hegelian logic, was simply a defense mechanism, a way for humans to protect themselves from despair. But despair, Schopenhauer believed, was the first step toward wisdom. He once said that truth enters the world like sunlight into a dark room. Painful at first, but necessary to see. This was the war he fought, not against Hegel himself, but against the seduction of illusion. He believed that most people do not want truth, they want comfort. They would rather live inside a coherent lie than confront a chaotic reality. And so, entire systems of belief, religion, politics, progress, even art, become elaborate defenses against the unbearable. Schopenhauer tore those defenses down, one by one, with surgical cruelty. He saw through everything: the pride of intellect, the vanity of nations, the optimism of progress. Even love, he wrote, was not what it seemed. It was merely the will reproducing itself, a biological conspiracy disguised as romance. To fall in love was to obey the species, not the heart. For Schopenhauer, there was no escape from this machinery of desire, except through understanding it. Knowledge, not faith, was his version of salvation. He wrote, "To know the truth is to strip away the dream of purpose. What remains is reality, raw, merciless, and real." He became a kind of ascetic of reason, a philosopher monk without a temple. He lived alone, wrote by candlelight, and surrounded himself with reflections. A mirror above his desk, another by the window. He said he needed to see himself clearly, to remind himself that even he was part of the illusion he was destroying. In his solitude, he sharpened his ideas like blades, and with each stroke, he cut deeper into the vanity of his age. He rejected the optimism of science, the moral pretensions of religion, and the social pretenses of philosophy. He sought only one thing: clarity. To him, the world was not a problem to be solved, but a mirror to be understood. He often compared it to a dream, a projection of the will, a film of appearances playing in the mind. When people asked him what his goal was, he said, to wake up. For Schopenhauer, truth was awakening, a quiet act of rebellion against the hypnosis of civilization. And yet, even as he dismantled illusion, he found beauty in the fragments it left behind. He admired art, because it transformed pain into form. He admired music, because it spoke directly to the soul without lying. And he admired tragedy, because it was the only art honest enough to end in sorrow. By the 1830s, his defiance had hardened into legend. He refused to attend philosophical gatherings, refused to speak politely of his peers, and refused to soften his words for the sake of reputation. He once said, "If I had to choose between being right and being popular, I would rather be hated by fools than loved by flatterers." His friends called him bitter. He called himself awake. In an age intoxicated by reason, Schopenhauer became its sober witness. He saw that optimism is not strength, it is denial, and that the first act of wisdom is to stop pretending that pain has meaning. To the very end of his life, he never forgave philosophy for abandoning truth. He wrote, "The task of thought is not to reconcile us with the world, but to show us why reconciliation is impossible." He saw philosophy not as a cure, but as an X-ray. Its duty was not to heal, but to reveal. And though he lost every battle for fame in his lifetime, the war he started would echo long after his death, in the writings of Nietzsche, in the psychology of Freud, in the skepticism of the modern mind. For he had shown that beneath every illusion, even the illusion of reason, there is always a wound, and that only those who dare to look at it can ever call themselves free. For Schopenhauer, truth was a wound, but art was the light that made that wound visible. He believed that philosophy and aesthetics were not separate realms of thought, but two sides of the same mirror. One revealed the abyss, the other, the beauty that made the abyss bearable. In his solitude, long after he had abandoned the lecture halls, he began to write about art as if it were the last refuge left to humankind. Because if life was, as he said, a restless striving born of suffering, then beauty was the moment when the will, that blind, eternal drive, stopped moving. For a few brief seconds, in the presence of something truly beautiful, the storm of desire falls silent. He called this state pure contemplation, a consciousness without craving, a moment when one is no longer a subject seeking something, but simply an eye, open, clear, detached. When one gazes at a mountain, or listens to a piece of music, or stands before a painting that seems to breathe, there is, he said, a sudden hush in the soul. The noise of I want disappears, and what remains is simply I see. That moment, to Schopenhauer, was a kind of temporary enlightenment. It was not salvation, but it was peace. He wrote, "In the instant of aesthetic perception, we are delivered from the servitude of the will. We are, for that moment, pure knowing." It was the closest the human mind could come to escaping itself. The world, for Schopenhauer, was a mirror, and art was the only way to look into that mirror without despair. He described how, when we look upon beauty, we are not seeing a thing as it appears to the senses, but as it truly is, as idea, as the eternal essence that exists beyond the individual and the transient. A tree is no longer a tree we might cut down or climb. It becomes the idea of treeness, the quiet pulse of existence itself, freed from utility. In art, the will is still there, but tamed, transfigured, translated into form, color, and sound. Through that transformation, suffering becomes meaning. But there was one art, above all others, that Schopenhauer believed spoke directly to the heart of reality: music. Unlike painting or poetry, music did not imitate the world of appearances. It was the world in sound. He wrote, "Music is the direct copy of the will itself. It expresses the innermost nature of all reality." Every melody, he thought, was the movement of the will, its rise and fall, its striving, and its release. Harmony was the reconciliation of tension, dissonance, the echo of suffering, and silence, that sacred pause between notes, was the brief moment of deliverance. In music, Schopenhauer found something like faith. It was his prayer, his meditation, his bridge between despair and understanding. He often listened to Mozart and Rossini, and would later influence Wagner, who saw in Schopenhauer's writings the blueprint for a new kind of total art, a music that does not entertain, but reveals. Through sound, Schopenhauer believed, we could glimpse the movement of existence itself, not in words or symbols, but in feeling. Music did not argue, it simply was, and in being, it told the truth more deeply than reason ever could. But the mirror had another side. For every moment of beauty, there was a reminder of the abyss. To see the world clearly, even through art, was also to see its suffering with new eyes. Schopenhauer believed that the artist is not merely someone who decorates reality, but one who suffers on behalf of others, a kind of metaphysical witness. Because to capture the world's beauty, one must first feel its pain. And so, the artist becomes both priest and patient, a soul translating agony into grace. This duality fascinated him, that art could both express and suspend the will, that through tragedy, humans could experience catharsis, a cleansing that does not erase pain, but makes it bearable. He admired Greek tragedy for that reason. He saw in it a profound honesty. Heroes who fight nobly, not because they will win, but because they cannot help fighting. Their defeat is not failure, but revelation. In tragedy, the audience recognizes itself, and for a moment, accepts the truth of life without bitterness. That acceptance, Schopenhauer said, is the first step toward wisdom. He also admired the quiet grace of still life, the simplicity of landscape, the serene smile of a Buddha statue. In them, he saw the image of denial, the moment when the will ceases to demand. He once wrote that the face of a truly wise person resembles a calm sea under a full moon. It was not joy he admired, but stillness, the silence that follows understanding. Because in that silence, there is no more striving. And where there is no striving, there is no suffering. But Schopenhauer knew that such peace could never last. Beauty, like music, fades. The moment ends, the will stirs again, and the hunger returns. He compared it to awakening from a dream of serenity. Gone the instant consciousness returns. Yet, for him, that fleeting glimpse was enough. He wrote, "Art is the way by which the world redeems itself moment by moment. To live without art," he said, "is to drown in the noise of the will. To create, to listen, to behold, is to breathe." In those years in Frankfurt, as his fame slowly grew and his hair turned white, he lived surrounded by beauty, paintings, sculptures, music, books. He would spend hours sitting before a single work of art, studying it not as an object, but as a window into another dimension. Visitors described his apartment as both shrine and fortress, a place where a man could live alone without feeling lonely. In that space, he had finally made peace with the abyss. He had realized that the world would not change, but that how one sees it could. To look into a painting, to listen to a sonata, to trace a line of poetry, was to hold up a mirror to the chaos of existence and find, within its reflection, a strange and fragile order. For Schopenhauer, that was enough. He no longer asked the world to make sense. He only asked for the courage to see it clearly. Because in that act of seeing, in that silent communion between mind and world, suffering becomes something else, understanding. And perhaps that understanding is the only redemption the human heart will ever know. There comes a moment in every life when striving begins to feel like a sickness, when even success, the glittering crown of the will, tastes bitter. For Schopenhauer, that moment was not defeat. It was awakening. He called it the denial of the will to live, a phrase often misunderstood, for it was not about death, but about freedom. Freedom from the endless compulsion to want. He wrote, "To will nothing is to be free from pain. Where the will ceases, peace begins." It was the quiet art of letting go, the most radical act in a world addicted to desire. Schopenhauer's philosophy had long described existence as an eternal storm of striving. The will, he said, is blind, an insatiable hunger that drives every creature to survive, to reproduce, to dominate, to grasp. It is the same will that burns in the seed pushing through soil, in the predator chasing prey, and in the human heart that says, "I must have this to be whole." And yet, every satisfaction only feeds the fire. Every desire fulfilled gives birth to two more. Life, he wrote, is like an unquenchable thirst, a fever that mistakes its own burning for warmth. To live is to be compelled. To be compelled is to suffer. But to recognize this, to see the will as it is, that is the beginning of wisdom. He believed that few ever reach this recognition. Most are trapped in what he called the dream of willing, the endless chase after things that promise happiness but never deliver it. They run through life like moths circling a lamp, mistaking the light for salvation until the flame consumes them. But some, a rare few, grow weary of the chase. They begin to sense the futility of the game itself. They stop running. They turn inward. And in that inward silence, the will begins to loosen its grip. This, for Schopenhauer, was not despair, but transcendence. It was the point at which one looks upon life not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. He found examples of this in asceticism, in mystics and monks, in saints and sages across cultures, individuals who had renounced pleasure, not because they hated the world, but because they finally saw it clearly. He admired the Hindu ascetic, who withdraws to the forest, the Buddhist monk who sits beneath the Bodhi tree, the Christian mystic who prays not for reward, but for surrender. Each, he believed, had touched the same truth, that liberation begins where desire ends. He wrote, "The true saint is he who denies the will, not through reasoning, but through the quiet intuition that nothing can satisfy it. In such a person, the fire of wanting burns itself out. The will grows still. What remains is not emptiness, but serenity, a calm acceptance that life, as it is both tragic and sufficient." Schopenhauer called this resignation, but in his usage the word meant something luminous, not defeat, but peace. To the modern world, this sounded like nihilism. To him, it was compassion in its purest form. For when one stops seeing themselves as the center of striving, when the ego dissolves into the universal pain of existence, compassion arises naturally. He who sees through the veil of Maya, he wrote, no longer divides himself from others. In every creature, he recognizes his own suffering. Compassion, then, was not moral virtue. It was metaphysical awakening. The saint, the artist, the philosopher, all were, in their own ways, souls who had glimpsed the futility of the will and responded not with cynicism, but with tenderness. He often spoke of pity as the highest ethic. Not the weak emotion of condescension, but the deep identification with another's pain. If all beings are expression of the same will, then to harm another is to harm oneself. To ease another's suffering is to momentarily silence the will within. This, he believed, was why kindness feels sacred, because it is the brief triumph of understanding over illusion. And though he was not religious, his compassion had a spiritual weight. It was the humility that comes when one realizes the world owes them nothing, and that nothing can be truly owned. He found the image of this truth in nature itself, the tree that bends with the wind and survives, the river that yields and therefore endures. To deny the will was to align oneself with the deep rhythm of existence, to no longer struggle against what is, but to become part of its quiet flow. In that surrender, he said, there is a joy more profound than pleasure, the joy of peace. A joy that does not shout, but hums softly beneath all things. Yet, he never idealized withdrawal. He knew the world would continue as it always had, desire feeding on desire, generation after generation. He never claimed that denial of the will was for everyone. He only claimed it was possible, that there exists within the human spirit a door, a passage from craving to compassion, from noise to silence, from bondage to understanding. And for those who find it, the world remains the same, but the suffering changes shape. It becomes light, the kind that no longer burns. Near the end of his life, he would often sit by the river Main in Frankfurt, watching the water drift past in silence. He would sometimes say, all things are waves. They rise, they fall, they return. He saw in that endless motion the image of existence itself. To fight the current is to drown. To flow with it is to see. And perhaps, he thought, the final wisdom is not to change the world, but to stop asking it to be more than it is. In that acceptance, Schopenhauer found something rare, a serenity not dependent on success or hope, but born from clarity. He knew that the world was full of pain, that the will was unstoppable, and that illusion would always return. But he also knew that the human soul has a secret freedom, the freedom to let go, to love the world even as one releases it, to act with compassion without believing that compassion will save us. to find stillness not after victory, but in surrender. That, he wrote, is the truest form of strength, and the only kind worth seeking. There are two kinds of wisdom in the world, one that speaks and one that is silent. The first belongs to philosophers, who dissect the world with words, who analyze, classify, and define. The second belongs to saints, who look upon the same world and simply forgive it. Arthur Schopenhauer lived between the two. He was the thinker who longed to be still, the man of reason who envied those who had transcended it. He once wrote, "The philosopher must see what the saint feels. Both gaze upon the same truth, one through the light of intellect, the other through the warmth of compassion." It was the closest he ever came to prayer. For most of his life, Schopenhauer believed that truth could be reached only through thought, through ruthless clarity, through the stripping away of illusion. He distrusted emotion, despised sentiment, and dismissed religion as humanity's most enduring self-deception. But as he aged, and solitude deepened into stillness, his writing began to soften. He no longer sounded like the young rebel tearing down idols. He sounded like a man who had finally grown tired of fighting shadows. The abyss had not changed, but the way he looked at it had. In his later notebooks, he wrote of the saint as the final stage of human consciousness, the being who is seen through the veil of the world and no longer clings to it. To deny the will is not to reject life, he said, but to see through its spell. The saint is not someone who turns away from the world out of disgust, but one who stays in it without being bound by it. The saint, he wrote, is one who lives without the will as though he were already outside of time. It was, for him, the perfection of philosophy, truth translated into being. The philosopher describes liberation. The saint embodies it. He began to see that thought alone could not free anyone. Understanding the world as will and representation was not enough. One had to live as though the will were silent. That, he realized, required love. Not the passionate, consuming love of the world, but the quiet compassion that sees all beings as one. It was a kind of love that no religion owned and no doctrine could contain. A love that arose naturally from the recognition of shared suffering. To Schopenhauer, the saint was not a believer, but a knower. One who no longer needed faith, because he had seen the truth directly. He saw reflections of this figure in many traditions. In the Buddhist monk who sits unmoving beneath the Bodhi tree, in the Christian mystic who whispers, "Thy will be done," not from submission, but from understanding. In the Hindu ascetic who renounces the world not to escape it, but to embrace it as illusion. He wrote, "They all speak of the same peace, though they know it by different names." And though he rarely used the word God, his writings grew more reverent with each passing year. He no longer mocked religion. He began to see in it the poetic form of what philosophy had tried to say in prose. Religion, he said, is the metaphysics of the heart. Philosophy, the metaphysics of the mind. And both, when honest, lead to the same door. He also saw that not all saints live in monasteries. Some walk the streets, teach, write, or suffer quietly among others. What defines them is not their robe, but their vision. They see the same world everyone else does, the same cruelty, the same hunger, the same noise, and yet they move through it with gentleness. To Schopenhauer, that gentleness was the sign of true wisdom. He called it holy indifference, a state in which nothing can disturb the soul, because it no longer mistakes appearances for reality. In the contrast between the saint and the philosopher, he saw the evolution of consciousness itself. The philosopher says, "I understand the world is suffering." The saint says, "I forgive it." The philosopher seeks truth. The saint becomes truth. To him, the two were not opposites, but stages of awakening, steps on the same ladder leading out of illusion. And yet, he knew that most philosophers never reach the top. They spend their lives climbing ideas, mistaking words for wisdom. The saint, meanwhile, has no need to climb. He has simply stepped aside. There was a story Schopenhauer liked to tell of a man who spent his life studying maps of the ocean, but never once set foot on a ship. That man, he said, is the philosopher. The saint is the one who sails. And in the end, perhaps only the sailor ever truly knows the sea. He began to sense that philosophy, at its highest, is not the accumulation of knowledge, but the surrender of it. When the mind exhausts itself, when every question has been asked and no answer suffices, something shifts. In that exhaustion, there's an opening. A space where truth enters not as an idea, but as silence. That silence, he realized, is what religion had called grace. He still refused to speak of heaven or immortality, but he began to write of the eternal, not as a place, but as a state of consciousness that exists beyond the will. In that state, time dissolves. The self disappears, and what remains is a quiet awareness, without longing, without fear. He called it the peace beyond joy. A phrase that sounds like poetry, but in his mind was simply the accurate description of a consciousness freed from striving. One evening, a visitor asked him whether he believed in the soul. Schopenhauer smiled faintly. "I believe," he said, "that the light does not cease when the lamp is broken." He did not mean survival in the religious sense. He meant continuity, the persistence of being beyond the illusion of individual life. It was not immortality he found comforting, but dissolution, the merging of the self into the great stillness that underlies all things. In the saint, he saw the embodiment of that stillness. In the philosopher, the endless effort to reach it. And though he knew he himself was still a philosopher, still striving, still wounded, still proud, he found solace in the idea that striving could end. He often said, "Every truth I have ever found points toward silence." And so, the older he became, the quieter his life grew. He still wrote, still read, but his sentences slowed, his judgment softened, and his anger, once volcanic, began to fade. It was as if the philosopher had begun to forgive the world he had spent his life criticizing. In that forgiveness, he became, without realizing it, a little more like the saint he admired. The same man who had once called existence a curse now wrote, "The world is my representation, but also my responsibility." He had not abandoned his pessimism. He had simply found, within it, a kind of compassion. He realized that to see life as suffering is not to despise it, but to understand it. And to understand is the first step toward love. In his final years, when he walked the streets of Frankfurt with his small white poodle, Atman, neighbors often saw him stop to feed stray animals or smile at children playing. He seemed gentler, not because he had changed his mind, but because he had made peace with it. He had spent his youth fighting illusions. Now, in his old age, he had learned to let them drift by like clouds. Perhaps, he thought, this is all the saint and the philosopher ever had to teach, that the world, though cruel, is still worthy of compassion, and that seeing it clearly is the beginning of love. To see the truth, Schopenhauer wrote, is to stand alone. He did not mean loneliness in the sentimental sense, the sadness of absence or rejection. He meant something deeper, the isolation that comes from seeing what others refuse to see. For most of his life, he had been ignored, dismissed, even mocked. While Hegel's lectures overflowed, Schopenhauer spoke to empty halls. While others sought fame, he pursued understanding. and found himself surrounded by silence. That silence became his companion, his punishment, and, eventually, his peace. He once wrote, "The truth is like a lantern carried through a crowd. All try to shield their eyes, and some, blinded by its light, strike at the hand that holds it." He knew this feeling well. The more he tried to reveal the illusions of life, the vanity of ambition, the futility of desire, the suffering that underlies every joy, the more he was accused of cynicism. But he was not a cynic. He was, in his own way, a realist of the soul. He did not hate the world, he simply refused to lie about it. That refusal had consequences. To tell comforting lies is to be loved. To tell painful truths is to be left alone. And so, Schopenhauer spent decades in near total obscurity. His books went unread. His name was a footnote. He lived quietly, renting small apartments, feeding his dog, reading the Upanishads by candlelight. He grew accustomed to silence, not as emptiness, but as clarity. He wrote, "Solitude is the fate of all great minds, a fate they accept not because they wish to be alone, but because they cannot be otherwise." He began to see solitude not as exile, but as purification. When the noise of society fades, when one ceases to chase the applause of others, what remains is truth, naked, raw, and merciless, but also free. In solitude, he said, a person can finally hear their own mind speak, without interruption. And that voice, though often cruel, is honest. Schopenhauer's solitude was not sterile. It was full of observation. He watched the world with an almost monastic detachment. The streets, the markets, the people. He saw the endless repetition of human striving, the same ambitions, the same mistakes, the same illusions recycled under new names. He called it the eternal return of folly. And yet, he did not judge it with contempt. He saw in it the universality of the will, the same blind striving that animated himself. It was that recognition that all beings suffer from the same blindness that gave birth to his compassion. In his notebooks, he wrote, "He who has understood life can no longer hate anyone. He may withdraw, but never despise. To see clearly is to stop expecting the world to be otherwise. It is to replace outrage with understanding and ambition with calm." This was the paradox of Schopenhauer's solitude. The more he withdrew from humanity, the more humane he became. But solitude also has its shadows. There were days when silence turned to weight, when he felt the burden of being awake in a world that prefers to dream. He once confessed, "I often envy the happiness of the ignorant. They dance while I am counting the steps of tragedy." He envied the ease of belief, the comfort of illusion, but he could not return to them. Once the veil of Maya had been lifted, he could not pretend it was still real. That was the cost of seeing, and he paid it willingly. He described truth as a mountain. Most people, he said, prefer to walk in the valley where the air is thicker and the company warm. The philosopher climbs, alone, and when he reaches the summit, he finds the view breathtaking and unshareable. "He who sees far," he wrote, "must bear the loneliness of those who see near." To him, solitude was not punishment, it was the price of freedom. In time, he came to embrace it fully. He wrote that the greatest minds of history, Buddha, Christ, Spinoza, even the poets of Greece, had all known this isolation. He called them citizens of another world, not out of arrogance, but because their gaze had shifted from the transient to the eternal. Their solitude was not escape, it was alignment. To stand apart from the world is to belong finally to truth. There was, in his solitude, a quiet joy. He found it in small rituals, walking his dog along the river, feeding birds in the park, watching the evening light fade through his window. He found contentment in what he called the simple company of being. In those hours, there was no ambition, no argument, no striving, only stillness. It was, he believed, a taste of what the mystics had called enlightenment. Not a blaze of divine revelation, but a gentle dusk, the calm after the storm of wanting has passed. When he wrote about solitude, he often compared it to the night sky. During the day, he said, the sun of human noise blinds us to the stars. But in the quiet of night, truth appears, cold, distant, but infinite. To dwell in that vastness is lonely, yes, but it is also to be free. The one who walks alone, he wrote, walks with eternity as his companion. Ironically, it was near the end of his life, when he had ceased caring for recognition, that fame finally found him. His books began to be read across Europe. Young intellectuals quoted him in cafes and salons. Writers like Tolstoy, Thomas Mann, and Nietzsche called him a master. But by then, he no longer needed applause. He had already built his temple within. When asked about his sudden popularity, he smiled and said, "They have finally caught up with my solitude." The solitude of truth, he realized, is not a burden one carries forever. It is a stage, a necessary passage on the path to understanding. To see clearly is to stand alone for a time. But once one accepts that aloneness, it becomes something else entirely, serenity. He wrote, "When a man is content with solitude, he is already reconciled with the universe." And perhaps that was the real end of his philosophy. Not in despair, but in quiet reconciliation. In his final winter, as the river froze outside his Frankfurt home, he told a friend that he no longer feared death. "It is merely," he said, "the dissolving of the last illusion, the final release of the will." The man who had spent his life fighting illusion had finally found peace, not by escaping the world, but by learning to stand alone within it, calm, awake, and free. Long after Schopenhauer was gone, his shadow remained. Not the shadow of fame. That would come late. But the darker, deeper kind that settles in thought itself. He had lived in solitude, but his ideas did not. They escaped him, spreading quietly through the corridors of modern consciousness, through philosophy, psychology, literature, even art. Each generation that came after him would rediscover his voice, as if it had always been whispering beneath their own. It began with Nietzsche, the brilliant, fevered disciple who first adored, then rebelled. As a young man, Nietzsche called Schopenhauer my great teacher. He devoured the world as will and representation, as if it were revelation. Here, finally, was a philosopher who did not hide behind abstraction, who spoke of suffering as the core of existence, and dared to confront it without consolation. For Nietzsche, that honesty was electrifying, but it was also unbearable. He inherited Schopenhauer's diagnosis that life is driven by an irrational force, that meaning is illusion. But he refused the prescription of renunciation. Where Schopenhauer had said, "Deny the will," Nietzsche answered, "Affirm it." He would turn the old master's pessimism upside down, transforming resignation into rebellion. He would make the will divine, the will to power, the creative impulse that says yes even to suffering. But behind Nietzsche's defiance, Schopenhauer's ghost remained. Every god is dead was born from the same wound. Without Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's cry for meaning would have had no silence to echo in. Then came Freud, and the philosophy of the unconscious. Freud's Vienna was a century removed from Schopenhauer's Frankfurt, but the current ran straight between them. When Freud described the psyche as a battlefield of instincts, drives beneath awareness, forces that move us despite our reason, he was giving psychological form to Schopenhauer's metaphysics. The will became the id. Desire became repression. and the blind striving that Schopenhauer saw in nature, Freud found in the human mind. Where the old philosopher had written of the will to live, Freud spoke of eros. Where Schopenhauer had written of the denial of the will, Freud saw sublimation, the redirection of instinct into art, ethics, or love. The two men had never met, but Freud called Schopenhauer one of the few thinkers who had truly understood the human soul. Schopenhauer's influence did not end in psychology. It seeped into the bloodstream of modern art and literature, into Tolstoy's despair, Proust's introspection, Kafka's claustrophobia, and Beckett's silence. His fingerprints are there in every story that strips away illusion and looks into the machinery of existence. When Dostoevsky wrote of Raskolnikov's guilt, when Camus spoke of the absurd, when Kafka described man crushed by invisible systems, they were all, in a sense, writing footnotes to Schopenhauer. He had shown them that the modern soul was not born in progress, but in fracture. Even the existentialists, those who made despair fashionable, were walking paths he had already mapped. Kierkegaard wrestled with faith, Nietzsche with freedom, Camus with meaning. But all began from the same starting point, the recognition that the world offers no guarantees. Schopenhauer was the first to articulate that condition not as tragedy, but as reality. He wrote, "The world is not a riddle to be solved, but a truth to be endured." And that endurance, that stoic acceptance of the absurd, became the signature of modern philosophy. In the 20th century, his ideas found new forms. When the existentialists gathered in Paris cafes, debating freedom beneath the smoke of another war, they were echoing Schopenhauer's suspicion that civilization is just the will wearing a different mask. When Freud's disciples charted the map of neurosis, they were tracing his insight that reason is a thin veil over chaos. When the modernists broke art into fragments, when Schoenberg shattered harmony, when Picasso broke perspective, when Beckett reduced speech to silence, each was reenacting Schopenhauer's vision, the world seen without illusion, translated into form. Even science, in its own way, began to sound like him. Quantum mechanics described a world of energy and uncertainty, a field of forces without stability or essence. In a strange way, the physicists had arrived where the metaphysician had started. Reality as flux, order as illusion. Schopenhauer's will, that invisible current of existence, now looked less like mysticism and more like prophecy. But perhaps his truest heirs were not philosophers or scientists at all, but the ordinary modern people who live with the anxiety of knowing too much. For in the age of information, we are all Schopenhauerians now. We see the machinery of desire, the algorithms that measure us, the endless striving for satisfaction that never comes. We scroll, we compare, we want, and we know, somewhere deep inside, that wanting is the disease. The will has become digital, but it still burns the same. And yet, his solution, to deny the will, to seek peace and detachment, feels almost impossible today. In a world that worships stimulation, to sit still is rebellion. To be content is heresy. To withdraw from the noise is to vanish. But perhaps that is why Schopenhauer's voice still sounds so hauntingly relevant. He reminds us that freedom does not come from choice, but from release. That happiness is not found in abundance, but in understanding. He wrote, "Wealth consists not in having, but in not wanting. And in an era drowning in wanting, those words ring like prophecy." His influence extends quietly, even to those who have never read him. Every time someone questions progress, every time someone feels the hollowness of success, every time someone looks at beauty and feels both joy and sorrow, there too is Schopenhauer. He is the philosopher of the quiet hour, the voice behind every question that begins, "Is this all there is?" He taught the world that to see clearly is to suffer, but that in suffering there is truth. And perhaps that truth, however heavy, is the beginning of freedom. By the end of the 19th century, his ideas had transformed the landscape of human thought. But their truest echo lies not in the academy, nor in the canon, but in the human heart. Every person who has felt the futility of striving, who has paused to watch the world's endless motion and asked why, has heard him. Every artist who turns pain into beauty, every thinker who refuses the easy answer, every seeker who finds peace in solitude, is part of his lineage. He once wrote, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see." 2 centuries later, we are still tracing the arrow. Everything moves. Everything strives. Everything returns. Schopenhauer believed that beneath the surface of all things, beneath the wind, the blood, the stars, there was a single pulse, the will. It was not thought, not intention, not purpose. It was the raw current of existence itself, blind, restless, eternal. The universe, he said, is not a machine designed by reason, but a storm that endlessly recreates itself. And though the forms change, planets dying, species rising, civilizations collapsing, the movement does not. The will never ends. It only begins again. He saw this repetition everywhere, in the seasons, in the cycle of birth and decay, in the way love becomes longing, and longing becomes loss. Even in human history, he saw not progress, but return. Empires rise to the sound of trumpets and fall to the same silence. Inventions promise liberation and create new forms of bondage. Revolutions claim to end suffering and only rearrange its furniture. To Schopenhauer, history was not a ladder climbing toward perfection. It was a wheel turning endlessly in place. All striving, he wrote, springs from want, from deficiency, from discontent with one's condition. And since want can never be extinguished, neither can the motion it creates. He called it the pendulum of life, swinging forever between pain and boredom. Pain when desire is unfulfilled. Boredom when it is. Between these two poles, he said, the human soul oscillates endlessly, seeking in each new moment a brief illusion of rest. Happiness, then, is not a state. It is the pause between two forms of suffering. And yet, within that grim rhythm, he found something profound. He saw that the will, though blind and cruel, was also creative. It is the force that gives rise to art, to love, to consciousness itself. It is the fire that burns and illuminates at once. This duality fascinated him, that the same will that causes pain is also the source of beauty. Without it, there would be no striving, but also no song, no poem, no sunrise. Every great act of creation, he thought, is the will transcending itself for a moment, turning its own hunger into form. The artist transforms suffering into beauty. The thinker transforms confusion into clarity. The lover transforms longing into meaning. In each, the will is both prisoner and liberator, caught in the act of expressing what it cannot escape. He once compared life to a dream that dreams itself without end. Each individual, he said, is like a wave on the ocean, a momentary shape formed by a force that neither knows nor cares for it. The wave rises, shines, collapses, and the sea remains. So too with human existence. We live as if we were permanent, but beneath every name, every history, there is only the same surge, the will to live. All life, he wrote, is the self-assertion of the will. And when that assertion ends, the energy does not vanish. It returns. It begins again, in another form, another face, another striving. Schopenhauer did not believe in reincarnation in the religious sense, but he did believe that the essence of being is indestructible. Matter changes, consciousness flickers, but the will, the inner motion, persists. It does not remember, but it repeats. Every birth is the same story told in a new voice. Every generation inherits the same hunger, the same illusions, the same ache for meaning. To live, then, is to participate in the eternal recurrence of the will, the world endlessly dreaming itself. For Schopenhauer, this was not cosmic punishment, but cosmic fact. He did not cry out for meaning in it. He only sought to see it clearly, to understand life not as tragedy or comedy, but as rhythm, a rhythm that continues whether we dance to it or not. In that acceptance, he found peace. He wrote, "To know the will is to cease being its instrument. To see the machinery of striving is to step outside it, even for a moment. It does not stop the motion, but it loosens its hold." He often described this awakening as a shift in perception, a turning of the inner eye. Most people, he said, live as if they were the doers of life. The awakened see that they are merely its witnesses. It is not that the will stops acting, but that one no longer identifies with it. The river still flows, but the mind no longer thrashes in its current. That quiet detachment, that calm awareness of motion without resistance, was, to him, the highest state of consciousness. He found it mirrored in the teachings of the East, in the Buddhist notion of samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death, and in the promise of nirvana, the stillness beyond the wheel. He admired the Buddha not as a prophet, but as a fellow observer of the will. Both had seen that existence is suffering, and that peace lies not in conquest, but in surrender. But where the Buddha spoke of compassion, Schopenhauer spoke of clarity. For him, the goal was not moral salvation, but metaphysical liberation, to become, as he said, the pure mirror of the world, a consciousness that reflects everything and clings to nothing. In that mirror, the world continues its dance, but the watcher has ceased to be a dancer. He saw in this vision a kind of eternal return, not Nietzsche's heroic affirmation of life, but a serene recognition of recurrence. The will repeats itself endlessly. But if one can look upon that repetition without resistance, without illusion, then eternity itself becomes bearable. Life, seen without attachment, is not torment. It is motion. And motion, once understood, is peace. The world, he wrote, is like a dream, and he who has seen through it can smile while it continues. To Schopenhauer, that smile was enlightenment, not joy, not victory, but understanding. He had no faith in redemption, no belief in heaven, no promise of escape. Only the knowledge that the will moves on, and that within that movement lies both bondage and beauty. The world repeats, the will returns, and through it all, the wise remain still. They do not seek to change the circle, they learn to stand at its center. In his final years, Arthur Schopenhauer came to see that clarity, once fully achieved, does not end in despair. It ends in compassion. He had spent a lifetime studying pain, its logic, its permanence, its place at the center of existence. And yet, the more deeply he understood it, the less he could condemn the world that caused it. Because to understand suffering completely is to realize that it belongs to everyone. The fool thinks pain is personal. The wise know it is universal. And from that realization, he said, flows the only true morality. He wrote, "Compassion is the purest expression of knowledge." To him, pity was not weakness, it was the mark of awakening. When a person sees through the veil of individuality, when they understand that every creature, from the insect to the emperor, is driven by the same blind will, then cruelty becomes impossible. How can you harm another when you know that the same flame burns in both of you? The act of understanding becomes the act of mercy. For Schopenhauer, compassion, Mitleid, was not sentimental. It was metaphysical. It was the recognition that the boundaries between self and other are illusions maintained by the will. The pain I inflict on you is pain that exists in me. The joy I destroy in you is the joy I extinguish in myself. Every blow, every cruelty, every indifference is the will turning against itself. In that sense, compassion is not charity. It is self-knowledge. He believed this was the only path toward genuine morality. Ethics built on rules, on divine command, on reason. These, he said, are merely calculations. They restrain behavior, but never transform the heart. But compassion arises naturally when illusion falls away. It does not ask, what is right? It simply feels, this too is me. And from that feeling, the impulse to harm dissolves. The moral law, he wrote, is not a command, but a recognition. He found confirmation of this in every tradition that spoke of awakening. In the Buddha's teaching that all beings suffer, and that enlightenment begins with empathy. In Christ's command to love one's neighbor as oneself. In the Hindu idea of Atman, the self that is in all. Different words, same revelation. That to see clearly is to love quietly. Not the love that possesses, but the love that understands. He saw that most cruelty in the world comes not from hatred, but from ignorance. The illusion that others are separate. The tyrant, the murderer, the indifferent man all share one blindness. They see only the surface of things, but to the awakened mind, the boundary dissolves. Every cry becomes one's own. Every wound, familiar. Every death, a mirror. That is why, he said, compassion is not taught. It is remembered. It is the ancient knowledge buried beneath the noise of the will. He called compassion the negation of the will. For when one truly feels another's pain, the impulse to dominate, to consume, to win, falls away. The ego, the I, collapses. What remains is the quiet solidarity of existence. In that moment, the will, which had always striven to separate, turns inward and sees itself. That seeing, he said, is the beginning of peace. But Schopenhauer was no naive optimist. He knew compassion could not save the world. The will would go on, blind and hungry as ever. Wars would return. Desire would return. Suffering would renew itself in every birth. But even if the fire could not be extinguished, it could be understood. And in that understanding, the flames no longer consumed the heart. He wrote, "He who understands the nature of suffering ceases to add to it." That, for him, was salvation enough. He often imagined compassion as a kind of light. Small, fragile, but indestructible. It does not conquer darkness, it simply refuses to become it. It moves quietly through the world, not preaching, not correcting, but recognizing. Every act of gentleness, every pause before cruelty, every unspoken forgiveness, these, he said, are the moments when the will is overcome. They are the true miracles of the human condition. In this way, Schopenhauer transformed his pessimism into a philosophy of mercy. He began as a man convinced that life was meaningless, and ended as a man who saw meaning in kindness itself. He no longer asked the world to be good. He asked only that it be seen clearly, and that clarity would do the rest. Because when illusion dies, so does indifference. He wrote of saints and sages not as supernatural beings, but as those who have mastered the art of seeing. They do not fight the world, they accept it. They do not demand perfection. They act with compassion in spite of imperfection. Their peace does not come from escape, but from understanding. To Schopenhauer, that was the ultimate virtue. To suffer consciously and still remain kind. He found beauty even in small, ordinary gestures. The old woman feeding pigeons, the doctor who treats the poor, the artist who paints not for fame, but to reveal the soul of things. These were not trivial to him. They were glimpses of awakening. The will, for a brief instant, forgetting itself. Each act of compassion, he said, is the universe remembering what it is. He wrote in his final notebook, "All wisdom begins with pain. All compassion begins with understanding. And when both meet, peace begins with silence." He had spent his youth dissecting life. Now, in his old age, he was content to let it be, to live gently, to harm nothing, to understand everything. The philosopher had become, at last, a quiet lover of the world he once condemned. In the end, he left behind no disciples, no school, no church, only a set of words that still whisper across centuries. To know is to suffer. To suffer is to awaken, and to awaken is to love. At the end of all striving, there is stillness. Not the stillness of death, but of peace. Not the silence of emptiness, but of understanding. For Schopenhauer, this was the highest form of freedom. A liberation not achieved through conquest, but through the gentle extinction of wanting. He called it the negation of the will, a phrase that sounds bleak, but to him was luminous. The calm that dawns when the storm of desire has burned itself out. When the will turns and denies itself, he wrote, the world vanishes as a dream. To understand what he meant, one must first see what the will is, that endless blind drive that animates all life, to eat, to mate, to survive, to strive, to win. It is the same force that builds cities and destroys them, that creates art and commits war, that dreams of eternity and yet fears it. The will is the pulse of existence itself, and to live, for most beings, is to be enslaved by it. But occasionally, rarely, a mind becomes aware of its bondage. It sees the machinery of craving and feels, in a single moment of pure clarity, the exhaustion of it all. That exhaustion, Schopenhauer said, is not weakness. It is awakening. He believed that every being carries within it the faint memory of this freedom, a distant intuition of peace. We chase it in pleasure, in love and success, but never find it, because peace cannot be owned. It exists only when ownership ends. The more the will strives, the further it moves from rest. Only when it falls silent, not through defeat, but through understanding, does serenity appear. This stillness is not taught, it is discovered. He found the image of this truth in the Buddha's smile, that faint, knowing calm on the face of one who has seen all suffering and no longer resists it. In that expression, he saw the fulfillment of his philosophy, a being who neither clings nor rejects, who looks upon the world with gentle indifference because he understands it too well to fear it. He who has seen through the veil, Schopenhauer wrote, no longer asks why the play continues. He simply watches and smiles. The stillness beyond desire was not escape from life. It was reconciliation with it. The will does not vanish from the world. It continues to move, in the tides, in the trees, in the pulse of all living things. But the awakened soul no longer confuses its motion with its own identity. It lives within the flow, without resistance, without ambition, without the need to be more than what it already is. This is what he meant by freedom. Not the freedom to choose, but the freedom to stop choosing. He often used the metaphor of a mirror. The ordinary person is the reflection, forever reacting to what appears. The awakened person is the glass itself, clear, untouched, reflecting everything, clinging to nothing. In that transparency, joy and sorrow lose their boundaries. Pain is seen not as punishment, but as motion, part of the same current that moves everything. To live in this way, he wrote, is to experience life without the fever of life. He described this consciousness as the pure subject of knowing, the observer who remains when the noise of wanting fades. In this state, the self is no longer a noun. It becomes a verb of awareness, seeing, being, without claim or fear. It is not bliss. It is clarity. A clarity so complete that it no longer distinguishes between good and bad, success and failure, gain and loss. The world still turns, but the soul has stepped outside its momentum. Schopenhauer found this stillness in small moments, when the mind rests upon a melody and forgets itself, when one stares at a sunset and feels, for an instant, no separation between the watcher and the world, when a thought dissolves into silence, and the silence feels enough. He said these are not escapes. They are rehearsals for enlightenment. Each moment of surrender is a step toward peace. And though they fade quickly, their memory remains, like the echo of a bell that once rang in the heart. He compared the awakening mind to a candle burning itself away. The flame consumes the wax, the substance of desire, until nothing remains but light. And then even the flame disappears, leaving only warmth. That warmth, he believed, was the state of the saint, the artist, the awakened one, those who live without resistance to the inevitable. For in surrender, the will loses its grip, and the world, for a moment, becomes luminous. He called this the quiet victory, the only kind worth having. It is not the triumph of strength over weakness, but of understanding over delusion. It is not about overcoming the world, but about ceasing to fight it. To want nothing, he said, is the beginning of joy. To need nothing is the beginning of love, and to understand everything is the beginning of silence. The stillness beyond desire is not a destination. It is a way of seeing. The sage walking among crowds, the artist lost in creation, the old man sitting by his window. Each, in their own way, can live in that stillness. It does not demand withdrawal, only awareness. To move through life without craving is not to renounce it, but to honor it more deeply. Because nothing is expected, and therefore everything is enough. In one of his last notes, he wrote, "The peace I sought was never beyond the world. It was beyond myself." For Schopenhauer, that was the final revelation. He had spent a lifetime searching for truth in books, in arguments, in solitude. But in the end, truth was not hidden in theory. It was hidden in silence. When the mind stops demanding that life make sense, life, at last, becomes serene. And so, near the end of his days, he stopped writing about the will. He simply lived with it. He fed his dog, watched the river, listened to the wind. To the outside world, it was nothing. To him, it was everything. Because for the first time, he was not seeking, he was simply being. That, for Arthur Schopenhauer, was enlightenment, the stillness beyond desire. By the time Arthur Schopenhauer settled in Frankfurt, the great storms of his life had passed. The feuds, the failures, the long years of obscurity, all had faded into a distant hum, like the echo of a thunderstorm receding over the hills. He was an old man now, thin and sharp as a winter tree, living in a quiet apartment on Schöne Aussicht Street, his only constant companion a small white poodle named Atman, the soul, as he called it. Each morning, he rose before dawn. He opened the window, looked at the pale river main, and whispered the same words to himself. Another day for understanding. Frankfurt, in those years, was a city of merchants and bankers, indifferent to philosophy. Few knew that in one of its narrow apartments lived a man who had once declared that life was suffering, that the world itself was a restless illusion. He walked its streets unnoticed, a ghost among men who were too busy counting their coins to question what it meant to live. And yet, he was content. For the first time in his life, he no longer needed to be heard. He wrote not for fame, but for clarity. He spoke not for disciples, but for the silence that follows truth. His daily rhythm was as precise as clockwork, a discipline born from decades of introspection. He woke at dawn, read a few pages of the Upanishads, and whispered his favorite line in Sanskrit, Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. It was his way of reminding himself that the essence of all beings was one and the same. After breakfast, bread, milk, a single egg, he walked the same path each morning. Across the bridge, through the garden, past the same bench where he would sit and feed the birds. He watched them with the tenderness of a man who had spent a lifetime studying the cruelty of the will and had finally chosen gentleness instead. He had once been bitter, mocked by rivals, ignored by universities, dismissed as a pessimist. But in Frankfurt, bitterness no longer found a home in him. He had outlived his enemies, outlasted his critics, and discovered that victory was nothing compared to peace. The world, in its slow turning, had finally begun to turn toward him. Young thinkers from Berlin, Vienna, and Paris were rediscovering his books. Artists, poets, and musicians, from Wagner to Tolstoy, whispered his name with awe. But Schopenhauer did not bask in the recognition. He regarded fame as yet another illusion of the will. A quieter hunger, but hunger nonetheless. Fame, he once wrote, is the echo of an opinion, and opinions are the shadows of ignorance. Still, there was a faint satisfaction in knowing that his solitude had not been in vain. When he walked into his favorite cafe, the English Hof, the waiters greeted him with quiet respect. Strangers nodded as he passed. Young students would sometimes follow him from a distance, too shy to speak to the philosopher they had read about. He smiled rarely, but when he did, it carried the weight of kindness. There was no pride left in him, only an awareness of how brief everything is, and how even brilliance is just another spark in the dark flow of eternity. He spent his afternoons surrounded by books: Plato, Kant, the Vedas, and the yellowed pages of his own manuscripts. He wrote slowly, with the patience of one who knows that truth is not something to be captured, only revealed layer by layer. Occasionally, he would pause, lean back in his chair, and look at Atman sleeping by the fire. He would whisper softly, "You understand more than most men, little one." To him, animals were not lower beings, but innocent mirrors of existence, creatures untouched by the delusion of ego, living purely within the rhythm of the will. He loved them for their silence. Outside, the world was changing, industrial, mechanical, loud. But Schopenhauer's room remained a sanctuary of stillness. No noise, no politics, no ambition could reach it. He had built around himself the quiet he once sought in philosophy. Visitors described it as entering a different world, a place where thought itself seemed to slow down, where every object, the books, the quill, the old coat hanging by the door, appeared to exist not in time, but in contemplation. He had turned his solitude into art, and yet he was not a hermit. He still laughed, though rarely. He still met with friends, though he spoke little. Those who knew him said that conversation with Schopenhauer was like standing beside a calm river, deep, slow, and full of reflections. Sometimes he quoted his own work, but always with irony. He knew his words had become famous, but he also knew that no words could ever explain the peace he had found. The truths he once fought to prove had become, at last, simply obvious to him. In those final years, he wrote a small essay titled On the Wisdom of Life. It was a quiet piece, neither metaphysical nor polemical, just the distilled wisdom of a man who had made peace with imperfection. He advised moderation, solitude, kindness, and above all, detachment. He wrote, "To desire nothing, to expect nothing, to depend on nothing, that is to be free." These were not words of despair. They were the notes of a man who had finally stopped running from existence and begun to walk beside it. The city outside his window grew busier with each year. Factories rose, smoke filled the air, and the hum of progress grew louder. But Schopenhauer watched it all with the calm curiosity of a ghost. He saw the new age coming, the age of machines and revolutions, of science and nationalism, and he knew that humanity had learned much, but understood little. He smiled gently at the thought, knowing that the will would continue its restless dance long after he was gone. In September of 1860, on a clear morning, Arthur Schopenhauer sat by his window as usual. He placed his hand on Atman's head, took a slow breath, and closed his eyes. When the maid entered later, she found him still sitting upright, as if meditating, a faint smile on his lips. There was no struggle, no fear, no sign of pain. The will that had once raged within him had at last become silent. He had found what he had spent his entire life describing: the stillness beyond desire. The world would take decades to understand him, but eventually they did. Nietzsche called him the true educator of the modern spirit. Freud drew from his ideas of the unconscious. Wagner found his music within Schopenhauer's silence. And countless readers, ordinary, restless, wounded souls, found in his pages the strange comfort of being told the truth without illusion. He had taught them that even in a world of suffering, there is a form of peace that no God, no government, no philosophy can grant. The peace that arises when one simply stops fighting what is. He died alone, but not lonely. Forgotten by most, but understood by eternity. The man who saw life as suffering had ended his life in serenity. In his room, the candle still burned beside his chair, casting soft light over his books, Plato, Kant, the Upanishads, and a small note in his own handwriting. The world is my idea, and I am, at last, at peace with it. When a man spends his life staring into the heart of suffering, he either breaks or he sees the truth. Arthur Schopenhauer saw it. He saw that life was not a story of triumph, but of endurance. That every joy hides a shadow, and every victory carries the seed of loss. And yet, he did not turn away. He faced it again and again, until even pain lost its power to frighten him. In that courage, not of hope, but of honesty, he became something rare, a philosopher of compassion. For centuries, philosophy had been a cathedral of logic, built from reason, marble, and ambition. It sought to explain the world, to measure it, to master it. But Schopenhauer tore down the altar of intellect and replaced it with a mirror. He told mankind, "Look, this is who you are. Not a rational being in control, but a creature driven by forces older than thought. The blind will to live, to strive, to become." He did not invent suffering. He revealed its structure. He did not cure it. He taught us how to live with it. For this, he was called a pessimist. But that was a misunderstanding. Schopenhauer was not against life. He was against delusion. He believed that only by stripping away illusions of endless progress, of divine order, of human centrality, could we begin to live truthfully. In that sense, he was not a destroyer of meaning, but a gardener of it. He uprooted false hope so that a quieter, truer hope could grow. His vision spread like an underground current, slow and unseen, feeding the roots of modern thought. Nietzsche would call him the first honest atheist. Freud would find in him the first map of the unconscious mind. Wittgenstein carried his book The World as Will and Representation through the trenches of World War I. Even in art, Wagner's operas, Tolstoy's moral despair, Thomas Mann's novels, his voice echoed. He became the hidden ancestor of every thinker who asked not, how do we win, but how do we endure? And yet, his compassion reached beyond philosophy. It touched the soul of the modern age, an age that had begun to see the world without gods and was terrified by the emptiness it revealed. Schopenhauer offered not salvation, but understanding. He said, yes, the universe is indifferent. Yes, pain is inevitable. But within that truth lies freedom. For only when we stop demanding that life make us happy can we begin to see its quiet beauty. This was not resignation, it was revelation. He once wrote, to see the world rightly is to weep for it, and then to forgive it. In that single sentence lies the paradox of his thought. He did not ask us to deny suffering. He asked us to make peace with it, to forgive life for being what it is, to forgive others for their blindness, to forgive ourselves for our longing. That forgiveness, not faith, not reason, is what he called wisdom. In the century that followed his death, the world descended into chaos. 2 world wars, machines of killing, ideologies that promised paradise and delivered hell. And through it all, Schopenhauer's quiet prophecy became clear. The will, unchecked, devours itself. His warning was not poetic. It was real. It lived in the smoke of factories, in the roar of cannons, in the fever of progress that forgot compassion. But it also lived in resistance, in those who chose understanding over vengeance, truth over illusion, and mercy over victory. In the West, he became the silent bridge to the East. Long before mindfulness or Buddhisms became fashionable, Schopenhauer had already brought their essence into European thought. That freedom lies not in control, but in letting go. He read the Upanishads and saw his own reflection. He saw in the Buddha not a foreign god, but a fellow traveler, another man who had looked into the abyss and found compassion staring back. In all that lives, he wrote, there is the same suffering, and thus the same right to mercy. This was his religion, a creed without gods, a spirituality without illusion. In the modern world, his philosophy has quietly returned. In psychology, in art, in meditation, in every movement that asks us to awaken. We hear him in the words of therapists who teach acceptance over control. We see him in the artists who paint tragedy not as defeat, but as revelation. We feel him in the slow, steady voice of teachers who say, breathe, let it go. Whether we know his name or not, Schopenhauer lives in the pulse of the present, in the idea that wisdom is not power, but clarity. And so, his story ends not with despair, but with mercy. The man who once declared that life is suffering discovered, through his own honesty, that compassion is the answer to it. Not the sentimental compassion of pity, but the deep, wordless understanding that everything that suffers is part of oneself. When he wrote that, the world is my idea, he did not mean it arrogantly. He meant that consciousness and reality are one, and that to awaken to that unity is to love everything that exists, because it cannot be separated from what you are. In the stillness of that realization, Schopenhauer's philosophy stops being dark. It becomes tender. He began as a pessimist, but ended as a mystic. He began by condemning the world, but ended by forgiving it. His words, once sharp as knives, became soft as prayer. Compassion is the light that the world cannot extinguish. And perhaps that is what he was all along, a man who mistook his mercy for despair, until the light at the end of thought revealed what it truly was: understanding. Today, the old man of Frankfurt lives on in quiet corners of human thought, in the gentle voice of those who see too much, feel too deeply, and yet still choose kindness. He reminds us that to know the truth of suffering is not to be broken by it, but to be opened by it. That life's tragedy is not its pain, but our refusal to understand it. And that the highest wisdom is not to overcome the world, but to love it, even knowing it will fade. In that love, the will finds peace, the mind finds rest. And the story of Arthur Schopenhauer, the loneliest philosopher of the 19th century, ends not in despair, but in a quiet smile. For he has shown us, through his solitude and his suffering, that even in a world without God, there remains something sacred. The compassion that arises when one sees clearly. And in that moment, the world, as will, as idea, as pain, as beauty, becomes whole. As pain,